This is for the boys, round 10. I want to talk about something other men's content space really isn't touching, but I think is extremely important. And I would say that the therapy world treats this so softly that it's unhelpful. But I've been thinking about it for a long time because every single one of my male clients and every man that I know early in divorce eventually hits some version of this. It's a moment somewhere in the first 6 to 18 months after the marriage ends when loneliness becomes physical. Not metaphorical, not philosophical, physical. Your body, which has spent decades being held, being touched, being slept next to, and being known by another person, finds itself in a one-bedroom apartment with no skin contact in days. And the part of you that needs to be touched and witnessed and tended to doesn't care that you're trying to do this right and get through this process before you move on to the next person. It doesn't care that you've been told to wait before dating. It doesn't care that you've joined a men's group or taken up running. It doesn't care that you're trying to do the deep inner work before you meet someone so you don't repeat the same relationship. It just gets louder. So today I want to do 3 things. First, I want to name what's actually happening in your body and why the existing recommendations are not quite enough by themselves. Second, I want to look at what other cultures do and the clinical literature that I found about paid companionship, including parts of the conversation that almost nobody is having. And third, I want to dream. I want to sketch what I think a real support structure for a man in this season would look like. If someone were dreaming the perfect one into existence, we'll see what you guys think. We're going to talk about it with no compromises, and I can't wait to read your comments. So settle in. This is going to be a longer than usual episode, and I'm going to ask you to stay with me through some material that other voices in the men's content space are probably not touching. Because if I don't name it, you can't work with it. And to be honest, there were several things I was really curious about that I wanted to do some research on. And therefore, you're going to get to listen to what I found. Let's start with the body. Researchers have a term for what you could be experiencing, and they call it touch hunger or skin hunger. It's not poetic. It's a measurable state. A human nervous system is designed for regular physical contact with other safe bodies. And before your divorce, that was your wife. When that contact is removed for an extended period, the system registers the absence as a low-grade chronic distress. Cortisol stays elevated, oxytocin stays low, sleep deteriorates, and the man becomes more irritable, more reactive, more prone to depression, more vulnerable to whatever coping mechanism is closest to hand. This is not weakness. This is what a primate nervous system does when it's denied something it evolved to expect and was used to having. For most men in long marriages, the wife was not just a partner. She was the primary and often the only source of safe, nurturing touch in their entire adult life. So most men in your generation do not hug their friends. Their parents have stopped physically embracing them. Their kids, once they hit a certain age, stop curling up next to them. The handshake is the entire range of physical contact many men, adult men, have with other adults outside of their romantic partners. When that partner's gone, the touch column in the ledger goes from 1 person to 0 people, sometimes overnight. And then we're surprised when these men start making decisions that look irrational. They're not irrational. They're a nervous system trying to solve a real biological problem. with the only tools that our culture has given it. And they're not great. So what are men actually reaching for when this hunger arrives? Let me name the older list first before I get to the newer one, because both of them matter. Rebound relationships, transferring the weight, the entire weight of one man's emotional, physical infrastructure onto a new woman who will predictably eventually leave for the same reason that the first one did. Then there's transactional dating, the apps at midnight, swiping not because you want a person, but because you want any evidence that you're still selectable. And there's alcohol, momentary regulation, but long-term dysfunction. Reaching for the ex, knowing it will hurt both of you because at least it's somebody and at least it's touch. These are the ones the men content space talk about, if it talks about anything. And the data on them is substantial enough that ignoring them completely would be just dishonest of me. But I want to talk about other more controversial ways that men are meeting these needs. Let's talk about OnlyFans, because everybody knows about it. In the years since the pandemic, OnlyFans has become one of the largest emotional infrastructures in the lives of midlife divorced men. And almost no clinician or coach is talking about it. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that might surprise you. The platform has hundreds of millions of registered users, several $billion in annual creator earnings. The men's content space discusses it, if at all, as a pornography platform, which is, in my belief, a category error for some people. The clinical research on the actual usage pattern is very clear. A substantial percentage of long-term OnlyFans subscribers are not primarily there for sexual content. They're there for what researchers call parasocial intimacy, the experience of a one-sided emotional bond with a creator who appears through curated direct messaging to know them. A piece of research published recently described the platform as commodifying not sexuality, but emotional intimacy itself. The consumer pays not for the content, but for the sustained illusion of being attended to by a specific person. I read an interview with an OnlyFans creator who described a long-term subscriber, a divorced man who had paid her monthly for 2 years. Never once did he request explicit content. He sent her photos of his garden. He talked about the legal process. He asked for advice about his teenage daughter. The creator had become, without ever meeting him, the primary intimate relationship in his life. I want you to sit with that for a moment. And maybe that's something that you're experiencing right now. Because it's one of the most clinically clarifying things that I've read in years. That man was not consuming pornography. He was renting a partner or a wife. He was outsourcing the disclosure relationship function that we talked about in episode 7 to a woman who had paid to perform reciprocity that didn't really exist. The clinical term for what's happening to his nervous system is straightforward. He was forming attachment to a stimulus that couldn't and didn't want to attach back. Sugar baby apps operate on a similar mechanism with an additional in-person dimension. The largest platform, Seeking, has reported millions of users. The model is transactional. It's an arrangement in which typically an older man provides financial support to a younger woman in exchange for time and companionship. The marketing language emphasizes mentorship and luxury. The clinical reality for many of the men using these platforms after a divorce is that they're paying for the experience of being chosen by someone that they couldn't have been chosen by in the open dating market. And the temporary salve of that experience does not do much for the underlying touch hunger. But it does do substantial damage to the man's capacity for unpaid intimacy with anybody real in the future. I'm not naming any of this to shame you. Most of the men doing it are doing the most rational, available thing for a nervous system that's been left to solve a real biological problem alone. With no infrastructure built to help, what else are you going to do? I'm naming this because the cost is hidden. It does not feel at the time like avoidance. It feels like solving the loneliness, solving the touch hunger. The clinical research is now clear that it is, in fact, training the nervous system into a deeper version of the same isolation, with the added burden of a financial outflow and a stronger habit of seeking emotional intimacy from women who didn't sign up to carry it. Which brings me to the part of the conversation that no one is willing to be honest about, and which I want to look at without flinching, because I'm curious. Paid companionship and paid intimacy are not new. They've existed in nearly every human culture for which we've have any records. The history is worth knowing because it dismantles the assumption that the contemporary shame around the topic reflects some universal human verdict that we've suddenly come to. It doesn't. The contemporary American shame is a culturally specific artifact, and a relatively recent one, honestly. I'm going to give you my research because I got a little nerdy, but in ancient Mesopotamia and across the Mediterranean world, paid sexual and companionship services were ordinary features of urban life. Sometimes they were connected to temple worship. They were treated as honorable in some forms and tolerated in others. In ancient Greece, sexual workers were not the lowest status sex workers. There were specific classes of educated companions, women trained in poetry, music, philosophy, and conversation. They attended symposia. They conversed with politicians and philosophers, and in some cases, they become famously influential. There are other famous documented examples where sexual encounters by some of these people were a possible part of the relationship, but not the organizing principle. The organizing principle was companionship, intellectual exchange, the social presence of a sophisticated woman in a culture that otherwise excluded women from public life. In ancient Rome, an analogous hierarchy existed. At the top, there were certain types of workers. They were high-class courtesans who were educated entertainers and conversationalists for elite men. Below them, registered and taxed workers of varying statuses. I'm not telling you this to romanticize anything or promote it. And I'm not telling you that the women in these histories were always there voluntarily. Many were enslaved. Many were coerced. Many lived hard and short lives. The point here is more specific. In most human cultures across most of history, the existence of paid companionship has been accepted. Some versions of it were honored, some were tolerated, and some were criminalized. What was almost never present was the particular shape of contemporary American shame. That shame is not the verdict of human history. It's a specific cultural inheritance, mostly from the 19th century Anglo-American moral reform movements. And it's one of the reasons a man in midlife divorce, suffering measurable touch hunger, will quietly transfer money to OnlyFans every month, rather than say out loud to one person that he's starving. Other developed countries have, over the past several decades, experimented with different legal approaches to paid sexual companionship. New Zealand decriminalized the entire industry in 2003. I didn't know that until I did my research. Germany and the Netherlands legalized and regulated it. Sweden, Norway, several other adopted what's called the Nordic model. So they criminalize the buyer, but not the seller, in an attempt to try and suppress the demand. The research on outcome is genuinely mixed, and I'm going to give it like I'm going to give it to you straight because the partisans on both sides tend to flatten each other. In the legalized and decriminalized models, several outcomes consistently improve. Health outcomes for workers, access to legal recourse against violence, the worker's ability to report crimes without getting arrested, integration into the mainstream healthcare and tax systems. Several outcomes remain stubborn, though. Exploitation and trafficking persist, especially in unregulated and shadow segments. And the policies don't eliminate social hierarchies that push some women into the work in the first place. The most honest summary the research reports and supports is that legal frameworks meaningfully improve some outcomes, but don't solve others. And that the United States currently largely has a prohibitionist model, which produces the worst health outcomes and safety outcomes than any regulated alternatives. So without producing the reduction in the underlying activity, the prohibition is supposed to justify. Now, I'm not arguing for any particular policy or viewpoint on whether or not we should be legalizing this. I'm pointing out that the conversation happens in other places with evidence and nuance, and that the absence of that conversation in the United States is part of why men in this demographic have fewer legitimate options than they should. That's my point, and that's what I believe. This brings me to the corner of all of this that genuinely is appropriate for many men in early divorce. There is in the United States and several other countries a small but established industry of professional cuddling, also called platonic touch therapy or cuddle therapy. The largest organization, Cuddlist, operates under a published code of conduct that requires consent, full clothing, defined session times, no sexual contact of any kind, and the ongoing practitioner is trained, right? There is ongoing practitioner training. Sessions run roughly $80 to $200 an hour. The founder of Cuddlist has stated openly that the original target demographic was men aged 50 to 70 in loveless marriages or post-divorce or grieving. The research base for therapeutic non-sexual touch is real. Measurable reductions in cortisol, measurable increases in oxytocin, measurable improvement in the markers of depression and anxiety. There is serious academic literature on the cuddle industry, treating it as a rational response to what one researcher calls sexual society, a culture that has so thoroughly fused touch with sex that adults have lost access to the platonic touch capacity that most humans in history took for granted. So is professional cuddling clinically appropriate for divorcing men? The honest answer is it depends on how he uses it and if he's comfortable with it. It can be a legitimate bridge, a structured, regulated way for a touch-starved nervous system to receive nurturing physical contact while the deeper relational work continues maybe in therapy. It can also be a sophisticated avoidance if misused, a way to outsource the relational hunger to a paid provider so that the man never has to do the underlying work of becoming the person who can be in a real, unpaid relationship again. The same intervention that is used one way can be medicine, used another way, it could be anesthesia. So the judgment is really in the use, not in the tool itself. Could it be a useful tool for some men? Absolutely. Could it be problematic for some men? Yes. So, I want to do the third thing now. I promised at the beginning, and I want to dream a little bit. I'm a Pisces dreamer, and I'm a manifester. So I love coming up with ideas of how to solve these problems and I want to get some opinions. So if you've hung in this far, you're still listening, I'd love to know what you think about what I'm about to share. If we look at the list of things that midlife divorced men are currently reaching for to address the touch hunger and the emotional starvation, we're looking at rebound relationships, dating apps at midnight, alcohol, reaching for the ex, OnlyFans subscriptions, sugar baby apps, pornography, aggressive escapism through work and fitness, and alongside all of it, weekly therapy where it exists, doing what it can with 50 minutes every 7 days, men's groups where they exist, meeting weekly at most, coaching, often undertrained in the dimension that actually drive what's happening to a man in this season, friends, many unavailable at a disclosure relationship for men of this demographic, and family, often the worst available option, not because they don't care, but because they're inside the same system that's collapsing and they can't offer helpful perspective. So nobody's holding the whole man through the whole season with the right scope and the right boundaries. So that's the gap. And I want to sketch just a thoughtful experiment of what would fill it. If someone were dreaming the perfect support system into existence with no compromises for a man in the first 12 to 18 months after marriage ends, I think it could be a concierge structure, not a course, not a group, not a once a week therapy appointment, a retainer type relationship with a coach who maybe has a clinical background or a trauma-informed background, someone with formal training in trauma, attachment, and nervous system work, combined with coaching credentials. This person would function as something like a primary care provider for the emotional and relational dimension of the divorce, available for structured weekly contact, available for the hard moments in between sessions, available to coordinate with the legal, financial, and family systems pieces of the process as they're unfolding. Its scope would be defined, not therapy in the licensure sense. And in fact, therapy would be happening simultaneously, all right, like side by side. So this is not a substitute for therapy. It's also not romance or sex, and it's not surrogate partnership, not in-person contact of any kind. It would be delivered virtually for safety and for a lack of transference, but it would be provided by phone, video, asynchronous text, weekly virtual meetings. These are all channels that men are already using to organize the rest of their life. And the no in-person component would take away the risk of one person or another wanting to escalate the relationship into something else. And it would maintain a safe boundary. So I would say that it wouldn't be a limitation, it would be a feature. It removes any structural possibility of the kind of like conflations that the cuddle industry has had to spend years figuring out, right? And it makes support geographically agnostic, clean in its scope. The man knows exactly what he's getting and what he's not getting. He would be getting psychological, trauma-informed coaching with concierge frequency access, not surrogate companionship, not touch substitution, sustained, intelligent, clinically trained presence delivered through the same screens he's already on. His frequency would have to be calibrated to the season, right? Probably heavier in the first 90 days when the disorientation is really acute, and then tapering as the foundation steadies. Available for re-intensification if a court date is set later or around the holidays, times when things are tough, or maybe the first time the kids go to some big event with the ex-wife that you usually attended with them, something like that. Maybe the first dating attempt or a legal milestone. But there would have to be a code of conduct that's very clear, right? Just as clear as a clinical practice. Defined hours, defined channels, defined limits, no transference into romantic or sexual territory. But there could be emotional support, right? The boundaries would be the entire structural integrity of the offering. And the offering would provide the missing emotional support that the man needed, as well as maybe daily contact via text to be checking in so that the person doesn't feel so alone. This would be the same engine with the emphasis shifted, right? It would also work well for women going through divorce. A woman's track would emphasize like identity recover, reclamation of voice, somatic presence, whereas the man's track would focus on the friendship architecture gap, the disclosure deficit gap, the emotional support, and helping the man with ideas of ways and supporting ways to get the touch hunger also filled, right? This all is in part, up until now, been what the Loom Life has offered. The Loom Life concierge has offered women, but never men. And I am very hopeful that people who are listening to this chime in and give me an opinion about whether they think that this could work for men, and if it's something that men would benefit from in lieu of spending money on the sex workers, the OnlyFans, the seeking. So I'm sure there are going to be probably opinions that are all over the board, but I'm ready for them. I'm ready to hear it. Curious, and yeah, open to suggestions that I can share with other therapists and coaches who may be interested in providing this kind of support. I would really like to get feedback about what everyone thinks about this idea. Because at the end of the day, like, men do need more support. And we just talked about all the reasons why. So, very excited to hear back from you and hear how everyone's doing. And also in regards to the other things we talked about earlier in the episode, like, what are your thoughts on how men are using OnlyFans and seeking, and is it helpful? Is it okay? How are they using the dating apps? Is that working for them? Let me know. I'm curious. Until next time, thank you.